So now I'm going to just talk about a few propositions to do with photography and where we're at now. It's a very interesting moment for photography. Since the mid-90s, critics have been reticent to identify significant trends in photography. Back in 2000, we certainly did witness the cresting of certain schools or movements. Just to remind you, we had the Vancouver School of Jeff Wall, Rodney Graham and Stan Douglas. The Becker School, epitomised by Thomas Struth, Andreas Gursky and Candida Hoff. And of course, the American School of Scenographic Photography, spawned by the Yale-based artists Gregory Crewdson and Philip Lorca de Courcia. This is not to say, of course, that the powers that be who do arbitrate on these matters have reneged on their promise, nor the platforms have disappeared, as there exist now even more regular platforms such as MoMA's New Photography, our own Deutsche Börse Photography Prize, and many photography biennales, as well as a host of other major critical debates and symposiums that have taken place recently that explore these problems, such as the San Francisco MoMA Is Photography Over conference that happened in 2010, and the What's Next conferences at Aperture and at Foam in Amsterdam. But what seems to be missing is the impulse to codify a new set of common principles. Why might this be so? One might conclude that this mode of thinking has become déclassé. In the art world, in an art world that values pluralism and interdisciplinarity, perhaps medium-specific concerns and the impulse to group artists together have given way to a more expanded notion of art production, in which somewhat paradoxically the individual tends to take precedence over the group. So how then best to talk about what's been happening over the last few years? In the brief time available, I'll restrict myself to making a few propositions about just a few of the many interesting positions and changes that have taken place, focusing firstly on a number of US and European artists who have been developing new approaches. These are highly unsynchronized and unaffiliated with any particular school and not beholden to any set of specific theories. What interests me about them is that they operate within a set of terms that diverge from those usually used to understand the medium. And what I mean by that is that the institutional discourse around photography remains encumbered by a number of conventions which are tied to a specific reading of photographic history concerned with the camera's status as a tool used to depict states of things in the world. This history revolves around confirming or exploring Barth's assertion that the medium's essence is the ability of the photograph to testify that which has been. And I just think this is a lovely and very funny photo of Barth at the blackboard. Inextricable from this history is the idea that photography acts as a window on the world, a transparent glass through which we see images. And this tends to repress several integral aspects of the medium, such as its physical support and numerous decisions made by the photographer in capturing the image. And just to go back to Gursky, Wall and de Courcia, who we started with, this repression is present even in the stage photos that they produce, because whilst asking the question about the veracity of what we see through photography's imaginary window, they did continue to speak in the same sort of formal language as traditional photographers. So the new, still inchoate approach, which we at the Photographers Gallery have been exploring through a series of shows linked by themes, these themes being photography and sculpture, photography and collage, photography and architecture and drawing, is one that speaks of photography's repressed aspects around the idea of the different types of support that hold the image and techniques used in its creation. The type of work incorporated into these new approaches moves photography away from being a conduit through which images are channeled towards an idea of photography as a medium whose specific properties can be stretched and placed in dialogue with other media. So the work of this new generation falls into those whose experiments overlap with painting, collage, sculpture and drawing. And so, just to move on quickly to photography and painting, of course we all remember that at the beginning of the discussion reared its head through Gursky and Wall's attempts to create photography that rivaled 18th and 19th century painting, both in scale and in its allegorical heft, using elaborate staging effects and digital illusion. But in recent years, we've seen a resurgent interest in lensless techniques, and the work of Walid Beshti, Liz Deschênes, and Alison Roster, just three examples I give, and digital imaging software that move photography into relationship with painting, which is very different and less concerned with rivalry than it is with the creation of a dialogue or a space in which the two media can intermingle. Beshti here on the top left-hand corner produces photograms that he calls blind drawings because he produces them in the dark room without a camera and exposes them to different colours. He's interested in the generative aspects between the image and the object, how images are produced, because he considered images to be very immaterial, and he's much more interested in the performance of the darkroom in creating these images by chance. Liz Deschênes, an American artist, on the right up the top, is here represented by her 2013 installation at the Whitney Biennale, which is a series of photographs exposed outside, not inside the darkroom, to ambient light, and so to record subtle variations in tone. The layout here, which is fairly complicated, references the ziggurat architecture of the Whitney building, for those of you who know it, as well as the structure of tilt-shift lenses of the bellows cameras that she admires. And she aligns these two constructs of modernism with ideas that inform her work. And finally, down the bottom, the two images down the bottom are by the New York-based artist Alison Rossiter, who I recently included in an exhibition I did for the Rencontre Arles. And she is quite fascinating because she uses expired photo papers that she sources off eBay to produce cameraless images by simply dipping her work in Developer. And she allows the inherent character of a paper to talk to her and respond with either found photograms or these dipped painted works. Of course, we all know that these experiments have deep roots in photography's history, from Fox Talbot to Mahaut-Linhage. However, there are other contemporary artists who don't have such a direct lineage. They engage us with a photograph's surface not as a physical support upon which painting-like gestures can be made, but as a field of pixels where painterly marks can be simulated. One of the two artists I'd just like to draw your attention to is Sam Falls. In this image, we see him addressing digital photography as a virtual canvas, but these works really are the result of a multivalent process that combines the original analogue image, which is subject to digital manipulation, and then painting. Falls says about his work, abstraction as we all know it is inherent in photography as its distance from time and three-dimensional space. So I won't argue that most of my work isn't abstract, but a lot of my pictures are mechanically very straightforward. I really believe that my aesthetic perspective doesn't lie in abstraction or even ambiguity, although I find both these valuable in photography, but rather a lack of knowing mixed with a very inquisitive nature. The other artist who is very similar in a way to Sam Falls, and is often in conversation with him, is Lucas Blacklock, who also makes painterly use of Photoshop in some of his works. But rather than virtually painting on top of the image as Falls does, he paints with the pixels that comprise the image, so reconfiguring rather than adding or overlapping. He says, my work over the last few years has involved borrowing elements from many different traditions, documentary, studio, abstraction, and appropriation, as well as developing these more gestural methods, and yet trying to undermine these ready-made systems of meaning. As a result, they look a bit like they're infested with some kind of mutating digital bacteria, which I love, which causes his subjects to blot and blur. In Gabriella as a bunny, on the right here, the calling card of his work, a serious-looking woman raises her scissors to her face like eccentric spectacles. Blacklock afterwards literally cuts and snips the image via coloured overlays and silhouettes, giving the model a ghostly clown mouth and bunny ears, suspending her between a pensive melancholy and a playboy girl. And sometimes he uses these proprietary software tools, and sometimes he doesn't. You know, for him, it's just a cultural hook which allows him to experiment. So photography is less rarely talked about in terms of its relation to sculpture, except as a method of documentation. However, recently there's been an emergence of studio-based photography geared especially to still life, which I have found very exciting. And there's been a noticeable move away from the utilitarian view towards photography used as a site in which a type of sculptural activity can take place. And the key idea is the use of the frame as a box in which the world is arranged, as opposed to the analogue model of a window through which the world is viewed. Elad Lasry serves as an emblematic example, as he foregrounds as he foregrounds the framing of his image with custom-made lacquered frames, which have these glorious colours, which always match the colour of his images. And they're very small in scale and just very covetable objects. Whether his own images or those that he appropriates, he never makes clear, but they always exude a similar feeling of being fully integrated objects, not just images in frames. It's in his still lives and individual object studies that, like kitschy cats and onions, that his effect is most elaborated. And there's always a mild, uncanny doubling which occurs in which the objects in the image reflect back on the image in the frame. And despite all this seemingly diverse approach, it's very clear to see a lineage here back to the wonderful early 20th century still lifes of Paul Outerbridge and Paul Strand. So they even though that they look incredibly contemporary, many of these artists do themselves reference an earlier tradition. And then there's finally in this section there's an artist called Owen Kidd, who was in fact Jeff Wall's assistant, and you can see that I think. And he produces something called a durational photograph. Apart from these being beautiful images on the wall, there's always an element in these that move very, very slowly. But it's just extremely. One object will move extremely slowly, 360 degrees. And in this object here, it's the white element on the top left-hand corner, like the lamp that moves extremely slowly, 360 degrees over a period of 1.5 minutes. But you don't even notice it really. You have to be looking very, very hard at them. So Owen Kidd, whether a snapshot or a tableau, a photograph denotes the flow of time by its very lack of duration. These are his own words about his work. It reveals the possibility of two types of time, one that is frozen and one that is always mobile. I'm trying to reverse the typical effect of the still photograph, to ask people to think about creating stillness out of duration. It's a performance of photography that I don't think occurs so readily in the narrative activity of cinema. And for him, it's sort of, we all know about Cartier-Bresson's decisive moment, but here we have an artist who plays very much with that idea and with traditional approaches to still life and documentary. Finally, just on photography and collage, there's one outstanding artist called Anna Parkina who I'm interested in. She grew up in one country under two very different ruling classes, that of the Soviet Union and then Russia under Yeltsin, as she was born in the 70s, late 70s. And social agitation and revolution were part and parcel of her youth and thus her development. When faced with her work, one immediately recalls to mind the propaganda posters and artworks of the Russian constructivists, film noir of the 1940s, and pop art with the collages of pop artists such as Richard Hamilton come to mind. What impresses me is the way she talks about the constant flux of every contemporary life, her own identity as well as the position of women, often presented in her work as mysterious femme fatales, embedded in the images, and the history of Russia at the same time. So just moving on to a second, out of that area, into post-documentary photography. I've got a few people here who really interest me. Alex Soth, the American, work roughly incorporated under the title of post-documentary. This is all work which cheerfully dispenses with the burdensome issues of truth and ethical responsibility, power and authorship which freighted documentary under postmodernity. Released for better or worse from the imperative to critical and political self-reflection, many of these photographers have turned the exploration of the other into a form of self-expression. As Alex Soth, illustrated here, says, photography deals with surfaces, it's all projection. That's both the beauty of photography but also its frustration. So they're very cognizant of what they're doing, but they explore work with that ideal in mind. So by his own admission, Soth is more concerned with crafting a compelling narrative than exploring the space between himself and his subjects. And the other artist who fits into this category is somebody called Vivian Sasson, who was born in Kenya but is Dutch and lives in Holland. And her highly original work navigates the boundary very closely between art and fashion in an interesting way. In these two artists, what I see is there's a shift in the debate away from difference and otherness to familiarity, proximity, and estrangement. And as an extension to this post-documentary work is the research-based work of Taryn Simon and Broomberg and Channeran, both of whom we've shown recently at the gallery. For both sets of artists, research is as important, if not more so, than the visual outcome of the project. Taryn Simon's project, An American Index, illustrated here on the right. This is all the contraband that was discovered in one day in the US Customs. All the food that people take in and is then taken off them. That's one of the images from American Index, but it was a series of 60 images where she compiled an inventory of what lay hidden and out of sight in American society, exploring all aspects of religion, medicine, government, and science. It took 5 years for her to gain access, and she often includes in the project all the letters she wrote to all the authorities trying to request permission to get in, and most of them, of course, were denied. Including this customs at JFK. And on the other side, on the left-hand side, is her newest project. It took 4 years and was called A Living Man Declared Dead and Other Chapters, in which she travelled around the world researching and recording bloodlines, family bloodlines, and their related stories. In each of the 18 chapters that make up the work, the external forces of territory, power, circumstances, and religion collide with the internal forces of physical inheritance, and the subjects documented include feuding families in Brazil, victims of genocide in Bosnia, the body double of Saddam Hussein's son Uday, and the living dead in India. Her collection is at once cohesive and arbitrary, mapping the relations amongst chance, blood, and other components of our fate. And Broomberg and Channeran, artist duo from London, whose work involves enormous research either into archives, as the one on the image on the left is from an archive from Belfast Exposed, a community photography centre in Belfast, and where rediscovering the potential for meaning with an anonymous image, as they have done here. Or on the right, from a work that they undertook in Afghanistan, where they travelled with the British Army without a camera. And when they arrived at the place where they had to be, where the army was to do duty, they exposed a single piece of film where they were. And it was one of the few days of the war when nobody was killed. So the piece is called The Day No One Died. And of course, here they're asking questions about the nature of foreign photographers' intervention in war zones, and also the function of images during wartime. And finally, just to end off, I'm not sure if it's a big phenomenon here, because I've been asking a few people, but at the moment in the UK and Europe, the biggest thing that's happening is the self-publishing book phenomena. Every day at the gallery we get 3 or 4 artists sending us their handmade books, self-published books, and it's becoming such an amazing way for people to disseminate their work that it's clear to me that it's something that's not going to stop for a while, and which I feel is extremely suited to the photography medium, even more so than to any other medium. And it's an acknowledgement, of course, of the importance of the photo book throughout photographic history. We only have to think of Walker Evans, Let Us Praise Famous People, and Robert Frank's The Americans to understand the importance of photography on the page. And so this younger generation is really building on that heritage. But they also, of course, now can control all aspects of the production of the book, from editing to distribution. And for them, this has given them great latitude in how they create the work. So there are only 2 examples I give here. I could have chosen many others. Red-Headed Peckerwood by Christian Patterson incorporates and references the techniques of photojournalism, forensic photography, image appropriation, reenactment, and documentary landscape photography. On a conceptual level, it deals with a charged landscape and plays with photographic representation. It tells a pre-existing narrative about a 19-year-old boy and a 14-year-old girl who go on a killing spree over 3 days in Nebraska in 1930, all based on a true story. And it walks a very fine line in his recreation of it between fiction and non-fiction, and becomes really a meditation on the unfathomable nature of violence. So it does look like a visual crime dossier. He plays with those genres to create something extremely interesting. And finally, somebody who's become an overnight sensation in Europe, in the UK especially, Cristina de Medel, a Spanish artist based in London, who produced a book called The Afronauts 2 years ago. And the book was based on an article she saw in the paper when she was doing some research on Africa, that in 1964, just after independence, the Zambian government announced that it was going to go into the space race. You know, it was the time of when Africa was full of gung-ho ideas and optimism. And they actually did. For 6 months, they researched and they put money into the whole idea of having a space race. So there are many documents that she could draw on. But of course, it petered out. So Christina actually recreated what would have happened had the Afronaut had Zambia gone ahead with its plans to put men on the moon. Of course, she was very much helped by her grandmother, who did all the sewing of the costumes, and she stole a few glass lamps from the street to create the wonderful astronaut's mask. And so it combined a lot of fiction as well as fact, and it has been a sensation. And this little book that was published and made available 2 years ago for £35 is now not available for anything under £2,000. So she obviously made a good call there. And the thing that interests me about these books is that they're meant to exist as photographic books. They're not meant to be ever produced as images on the wall. They're right format. The right way to read them and consider them is in book form, because photography plays so well with narrative that often a book is the better way for an artist to present their work. So that's why I think it's so interesting. And I will leave it there because I think my time has run out. Thank you.
What happened to photography is such an open-ended subject, and it's great that it's being posed here as a question. I was given a similar brief quite recently in editing issue number 93 of Photofile magazine. And this one marks not only 30 years of Photofile, but 40 years of the Australian Centre for Photography up the road where Photofile is published. And the anniversary presented the opportunity and challenge to explore the medium across the 4 decades since ACP was founded in September 1973, and to speculate on the future. ACP's brief was to exhibit, disseminate and publish Australian photography in an international context, and its founding director Graham Howe coincidentally had worked previously at the Photographers Gallery in London with founding director Sue Davies, which is an interesting exchange there. So in putting together our special anniversary issue, I tried to embrace ACP's founding spirit, and I'd like to talk through some of the key themes and ideas that emerge specifically through a selection of the imagery here. So it was at this year's Venice Biennale that I came across a room of 1970s works. There's one here by the Nigerian photographer J.D. Okai Ojekere. And so it was in the 1960s that Ojekere began documenting his country's newfound independence through the wonderful symbol of his nation's female hairstyles, which sort of spiral and soar, as you can see here. I thought it would be interesting to start the issue not in Australia or Europe or America, but to give a sense of a more universal impulse by photographers in documenting their worlds through such poetic topologies. At around the same time, of course, there was Ed Ruscha's Every Building on the Sunset Strip, and his artist book, 1966 artist books in the collection of the Art Gallery here in Sydney. I'd like to return to the Australian Centre for Photography and Wes Stacey's The Road, which was first exhibited in 1975. Along with David Moore, Stacey was one of the founding figures of the ACP, and from 1973 to 1975, just as the centre was being launched here in Paddington, Stacey took off on a 2-year road trip around Australia, systematically documenting his journey with his Instamatic camera through the windscreen of his VW Combi van. The 280 photographs amassed were divided into 17 folios and arranged around the walls of the ACP in a way not dissimilar to Richet's Every Building on the Sunset Strip. And in her essay in this anniversary issue, Belinda Hungerford persuasively repositions Stacey's work in this tradition of West Coast conceptualism and seriality. Until Stacey's The Road came along, there had been relatively few local examples of the photographic road trip made famous by the FSA photographers during the American Depression. And it got me thinking about some more recent examples. And as it happens, the Steidl Press in Germany is about to publish Trent Park's photographic series, Minutes to Midnight, which had its premiere at the ACP in 2005. For this series, Park and his partner Narelle Autio had taken off on a 2-year road trip around Australia, similar in scope to Stacey's journey, but the results could hardly have been more different. Both with backgrounds in press photography, Park and Autio give the sense of responding quickly and instinctively to their surroundings, which brings a dynamism and narrative verve to their work. The images are presented here. The first one, the black and white one, was Untitled by Park, and this is Foundling by Autio. And they're the result of both artists dipping back into their archives from that original road trip 10 years ago. And both of these images were among dozens of previously unseen images pinned up as artist book pages recently in Adelaide, which again relates them back to Stacey and Richet. Revisiting an archive of images across time is an idea also explored by the Sydney-based Samoan New Zealand photographer Greg Samu. Part of the Pacific diaspora that has helped revitalise the arts on both sides of the Tasman, Samu was initiated with traditional Samoan tattoo in 1994, documenting this culturally important marker of genealogy in his 1995 series Self-Portrait with Paya, which is now in the Queensland Art Gallery collection. This is one of them. Almost 20 years later, Samu was invited by the Auckland Art Gallery to return to this series, which he recreated entirely through memory, and this time in digital form, with the detail both more explicit and less mysterious as a result. So collectively, these two bodies of work trace an image as it plays out over time and in shifting form between the analogue and the digital. The very materiality of film is the subject of Tacita Dean's commission that was presented at Tate Modern's Turbine Hall in 2011, and which travels here to Melbourne at the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art in October this year. Usually employing 16mm film, and in this case old-fashioned techniques such as aperture gate masking, and glass matte painting, Dean loves the qualities of alchemy, resistance and silence inherent in the analogue medium as opposed to the digital. And also she obviously loves the looming, she's very drawn to the looming obsolescence which she laments in this large-scale work. I think it's something like 17 metres high. Obsolescence, materiality and the circulation of images as they play out in sculptural installations are ideas that run through contemporary practice and form the subject of an essay by Natasha Bullock in this anniversary issue of Photofile. Natasha frames her discussion around two exhibitions, 1970s Photography into Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art and this year's Image into Sculpture at the Pompidou. And she says that this change in terminology from photography to image says much about the way the medium is now understood through an expanded field of digitalisation and proliferation. This is Simon Denny's sculptural work from the Pompidou show, and it's called Seven Drunken Videos Stupor, which is a good title. And it symbolises the drowning or disappearance of the analogue image behind water and some goldfish there, I think. And it underscores the stupefying changes in technology that bring forth these images into the world. So that one was in the Pompidou show recently. And Simon Denny, he's a New Zealand-born, Berlin-based photographer, or artist, sorry. Through her image making, Simran Gill is also interested in temporality, often using outmoded film stocks or presenting photography within installations that explore ideas to do with transience and entropy. And this one is her current work, Here Art Grows on Trees, at the Australian Pavilion in Venice. And the photographic work is around the back of the sculpture. Natasha ends her essay with a recent installation by the Icelandic artist Ronnie Horn. In this work, Horn places her light-sensitive solid cast glass sculptures next to the windows, allowing them to change colour and hue according to the atmosphere and weather outside. Nearby, Horn presented photographic topologies of a face, reflecting subtle changes similar to those of the glass sculptures, and offering a potent metaphor for the process of photography itself, one which is rarely still and ever-changing. Ronnie Horn's work carries the poetic title of Untitled, Consider Incompleteness as a Verb, and it was the perfect endpoint for Natasha's essay and for our anniversary issue of Photofile. Open-ended and elusive, consider incompleteness as a verb also seems a good point to pause here in our discussion of whatever happened to photography.
I'm going to give you a little bit of we'll go from the bigger picture we've just sort of been hearing about from the last two speakers, and I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about my practice. So it's a bit going from the large down to the macro. So for me, it's very much about, photography is very much about the image and the making of the image. So we can look at a whole range of the ways that photography appears in the world. A work I did a few years ago for the Blake Prize was actually a photograph. It's a surfboard, but it's actually technically a photograph. It was a decal, and so there's a wallpaper and a surfboard. You could actually ride the board, but we don't. It was a sculpture. So I just wanted to throw that in as one of those things to think about in terms of how photography has actually evolved. And you can see with the last two speakers where photography has actually mutated and evolved. We can talk about the lens-based media, but we can also see how the photographic practice actually shifts into these other traditions. I'm very interested in the way the image works. I'm very interested in the way we actually look at contemporary politics and the way the image is utilised in contemporary politics. And probably this is probably one of the game-changing images of this century. So this sort of incident, event, it was something that triggered global politics, and we'll probably be writing about this event for many years to come. So it was also like a Krugson. It was actually an installation, an event there was an event that happened, but radically these people started the event and then we recorded the event. So it was like a performative piece in some ways. So it was actually one of these opening gambits to the war of the image. So one of the responses that came out of the West was the response to that tower coming down was the invasion of Iraq, and so we actually had the Rand Corporation manufactured an image which was the end of the Iraq War. So this was 2003 in response to the 2001 event. So people are using the photographic medium, and people are using imagery to, pursue photographic evidence and pursue political dialogue. So these are the sort of things that I've been looking at and interested in over the past several years. And this radical notion of suicide and political events and death coming through suicide started me looking and working in the Middle East, which I've been doing for at least the last 10 or 12 years. And so, again, art as research, which has already been mentioned tonight. This is research of martyrdom soldiers from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And here you actually see evidence of the photograph as memorial, the photographic image as memento mori. You actually see the plates of Ayatollah Khomeini, the plates of the leaders, and objects that have been put into these positions where they are almost like little installations. And so there's this whole interesting aspect of the way that these images operate in the Middle East. So there's internationalisation of a proposition. The ideas of the martyrdom as well. So here you have mosaic images. This is the past leader of Hezbollah, and this is the object. This is the car that his family and he were blown up in, and then the blown up refuse becomes an object, and the object was taken to a mausoleum that they built. So you had this sculpture. There's a mosaic on the site where that happened. Then the car was towed to a mausoleum, and that car sits out front of this mausoleum, and you actually then go and visit the mausoleum. And so these ideas of imagery, memento mori, and the martyrdom iconography that was happening in that area is quite interesting. And you'd actually have people coming and getting the family photographs in front of the memorial. So the way that these guys were using imagery is very, very interesting. Notions of Islam not using imagery is not correct. There's a whole range of operating and using the image. The current leader of Hezbollah, for example, I love this quote from George Alexander, who's a great essay writer in Australia and a friend. He says, did you come by car, or did you come by plane, or did you come by photography? In Shia Islam, there's notions of the hidden imam, and the hidden imam is someone that will come, that will appear at the end of days. And here we actually have Nasrallah. He does not appear in his rallies so that he doesn't get assassinated, for one, but two, he's actually utilising this idea of the hidden imam, and he's hidden from his followers, but he actually appears via the lens. All the rallies, he actually comes to the rally via photography. So he's this apparition that comes into these spaces, and these rallies are huge. There's 500,000 people sometimes arriving at these sort of rallies. So it's a really interesting way that people are starting to use the photographic image and building on 1,200, 1,400 years of tradition and religion, and actually contemporising this tradition, which is something that is extraordinary to actually watch, and how these events start to operate. It's a very sophisticated way of utilising the martyrdom iconography and then folding back into traditional religious practices. And you see it as well in these are shots from Syria from a few years ago, where the Bashar the Elder, and you see this in a lot of areas where the iconography is used, paintings are used, photographs are used around the landscape, and none of them, almost none of them at the time, were ever defaced. You never saw graffiti on any of these images. When regimes fall and things happen, then images get damaged, but you actually never saw those things vandalised. And then you had these sort of photographs where the icon is, there's a head floating in space, just like you would see the apparition or the icon of traditional iconic paintings out of Christianity. Here we actually have the icon floating above the everyday, and you are always presented with the leader, and there's flowers, and there's this idea of again, the martyrdom and the sacred image. So I'm very interested in the way that all of these things started to operate. The rituals, the iconography, and the ever-presence of these people. And they were not always seen in public, but they were always represented by paintings, by photographs, and with Nasrallah, with video. Then stepping through that, and these ideas of within Islam and martyrdom, what is it about martyrdom? What is it about these things that are interesting? You always saw, and I believe the rose actually came out of Persia. It was a tradition, a plant that came out of Persia, out of that tradition of the sacred and the sacred garden, the secret garden. And you always had the leaders represented with flowers. And when you see the representation, the rallies in Iran, you'll always see these huge banks of glorious flowers. So these ideas of the sacred garden, so there were always promises with the martyrdom idea that you were going to a better place, you were going to paradise, you were going to these sacred, secret gardens. And I was interested in the way that these gardens operate. They're fenced in, so you can see down the bottom here there's a fence, so you actually have a fence, you have sanctuary, you have security, you have, in the Middle East, you have walls which protect you from dust, so you have this idea of nice, cool, green, beautiful spaces, hiding from the brutal sun and the dust and the wind. So there's a space of inclusion and sanctuary, and a promise of something that was going to come, and it'll be better for you in another life. And then I'll touch on some of the photographic work that I've coming out of that. But here's an example of work in Oman, where you actually come along very sort of hot day, 50 degrees days, and you're driving along these very deserted roads, and you actually come along, you can only see a part of this fort, but what you see is a fort. And the fort is constructed in such a way in the landscape that you have hills and a fort, and the whole garden is secret. You can see nothing until you enter the fort, and when you get onto the top of the fort, you actually have this whole paradise opened up to you. There's water, there's a village there, and there's millions and millions of date trees, and none of that vista is available to you from the front. So this is a real photographic representation of some of these drawings and paintings. So they are aspirational. They are things that they wish to come into being, and in fact they do come into being. You can see a photographic representation there, and then you actually see these secret and sacred sites that are places of sanctuary. So within those sanctuary, within those walls, you actually have narratives of inclusion. So you had the group, the tribe, and I can talk about that in Australian context too. We have the Australia is a moat, Australia is an island, and we have all this border protection debate going on in Australia, where on an island, and we have the biggest moat in the world around our sacred little space in Australia. So it's not about us and them, it's about all of us. So these ideas of the sacred and these ideas of the garden I see as relating to both of us. The Minister of Defence, the Minister for Defence in Vietnam War, Robert McNamara, actually had a great documentary. In the documentary is titled The Fog of War. So the idea of the fog of war is this idea that he came across and said, look, and McNamara was this guy, he was a computer whiz kid in the 40s and 50s. He came out of the Second World War. He systematised the Second World War. Very smart guy, was head of Ford Motor Company, became the Minister of Defence in the Vietnam War, became a loathed figure. But before he died, he made this documentary. He said, look, when wars start, it's so complicated that no human can comprehend what's going to happen, what has happened. And I inverted that, and with the work I was looking at, what we're really in now, post 9/11 world, is that we're actually not in the war of the fog of war, we're actually in a war of the image, where we actually have the fog is the war. We are being fogged by war, and we're being fogged by the media, by dialogue, by propaganda, by a whole range of people that want to discuss their point of view with us. So we are in this idea of we're in the war of the fog. So coming out of that, I was making these works that are looking at martyrdom, looking at the iconography, and these images are roses that I grew and then I documented over time, and they would be in fog machines and smoke, and the image would slowly arise out of the fog, and this idea of the garden and these image would slowly evolve out of these fogs, and you would actually see embedded notions of what's going on in terms of martyrdom, iconography, the war of the image. And embedded in some of these images around the edges there, you'll actually see faint traces of predator drones. And so these drones are actually making martyrs of people that are innocent or guilty. And you also see surrounding the sacred garden, surrounding the Islamic part of the Islamic world, are the drones on the flower, and embedded around that and within that is the Islamic motif. So playing with ideas of the way that these things start to operate. And these flowers would be grown in the studio over time, and I would document them. And then you would actually see embedded into them all the intricacies, the layout. And this is again thinking back to the complexities of these, the whole complex range of what happens when we're at war, what happens in terms of propaganda, who's talking, what's happening, who's listening, how do we receive this information. And then I'll jump forward now and looking at these sort of sites. Australia, one of Australia's sacred sites is another beach in Australia, but this is actually in Turkey. This is Gallipoli. So this is the landing site in Gallipoli from the water, and you're actually coming out of the water, coming onto the land. So I'm also interested in the way that the land operates as this biographical notation. So geography and geography is the writing of country, the writing of the landscape. So I'm very interested in the way that the landscape writes its history as well. So particularly in the Middle East, you actually see, for us, for Australia, this is a very embedded site. This site is rich with the whole of our Australian traditions and mythologies and aspirations around mateship and looking after your mates in times of trouble, and all of those things that we know about that are embedded in Gallipoli. When we move into southern Syria, this is a site in southern Syria, the biography of the country is really laid bare. What you see here, in one space, we have the Bedouin, then we have Nabatean, then we have Greco-Roman surpassing the Nabatean, and then from the Greco-Roman, we actually have on the hill up the top here, that's a Crusader castle, so the Crusaders came through. Then on the other hill, you have a big tower, and that tower is the Ba'athist regime, the Syrian army outpost. So you actually have, in the one site, all at the same time, collapsing time and history and space, you actually have from Bedouin to Nabatean to Crusader to the Ba'athist party, and even now back to the Bedouin. So the Bedouin are back in control of this space, and it's been going on for 5,000 years. So you can actually stand in this one site and see all of that history all at the same time. And that's really fascinating, the way that geographic notions work. This is a work from Cyprus from last year, and what you see here in detail, you can actually see this is again a biographical and geographical and geopolitical interesting spot, because you're standing on the hill here in northern Cyprus, and you can see southern Cyprus, and you know that Cyprus is divided by Turkish and Greek, and you're standing on this mountain range which actually splits the island in half. So there's a geographic split and there's actually a geopolitical split, which I find really interesting. Jumping to Aussie landscape, this is out of Balgo, so we can look at Indigenous traditions of inscribed and notions of country in Australia, and counteracting that with ideas of Balgo at the top, red country, western desert, all the inscribed ideas that we know about in terms of Aboriginality and context of culture. And down the bottom here, we actually have Nebo, Mount Nebo. So you actually have Moses telling the chosen people, this is your promised land. Well, this is the spot where he said it, allegedly. So we're looking at a country, we're looking into Jordan, into Israel, into the promised land, and then I like this sort of juxtaposition between who's promising what and where and how, and the stories related to country. Jumping into Aleppo, this is northern Syria now. So this landscape no longer exists. This landscape has been decimated, it's been bombed to pieces. And in the same space, so we're talking about this top image no longer exists, it's been bombed, it's been levelled. There's a very ferocious fighting going on there. But only about an hour away, you have a Byzantine village. So this is a Byzantine village from the 6th century. And now if you go back, you'll actually see the Byzantine village of the 6th century and the Aleppo of the 21st century are now starting to look the same. So I'm really interested in the way that history echoes. I'm really interested in particularly in these sort of spaces, Byzantium, and the way that the new work I'm looking at is the atomization of history, the atomization of culture, and the subterranean narratives. And in Australia we can have these subterranean narratives from Indigenous, but I'm also interested in the way that it works through issues and places like in Byzantium. In Byzantium, they actually had this wonderful thing which predicts photography, which I think is wonderful. And the idea was the image is not made by the human hand, which I love that idea, that the photography is not made by the human hand. These paintings were said to be made not by the human hand, and when the artist painted them, they weren't painting with their brush. God was moving through them and painting the painting for them. So there's a miraculous image happening, and the image would just appear via the vessel of the painter. And I was interviewed in northern Greece about photography, and the first question they said was, this idea of the Byzantine nature, the Byzantine theory, photographic theory, which I really like the idea of. And that's echoing into what's happening again in Syria, where you actually have the Syrian Orthodox priest. Here is a meeting between Assad and the Syrian Orthodox, and the Syrian Orthodox priest is there discussing what's going on in Syria at the moment, and down the bottom you actually have people with mobile phones, and what they're doing is photographing with a mobile phone an Orthodox priest being beheaded, which I'm not going to show you. And so the echoes of Byzantium are still there. When Constantinople fell, the third Rome was Moscow, so the Russians became the third Rome, became the third Byzantium. So you can actually draw a line between Rome, the second Rome, which is Constantinople, Byzantium, then you go from Byzantium into the third Rome. After the fall in 1453 of Constantinople, we actually go into the Russian Orthodox take up Byzantium and Orthodoxy. And so you actually then start to get this picture between what's happening in Syria now and why the Russians are actually supporting Assad and why the Americans are supporting the other side. And when you step back and you look at the Crusades and Byzantine history, you actually see the Eastern Orthodox fighting and arguing between the Western Christians. So you actually have a fight between the Eastern Christians and the Western Christians happening in Syria now. I've been told by a friend that in fact something like it's a 17-sided fight in Syria, and what McNamara is saying to us is when this, particularly now in Syria, what's happening there is so complex, no one can work it out. So it's more complicated than we can work out, and going into a 17-sided fight would be a bizarrely complicated thing. So these are things that I've been interested in. These are things that I've sort of been making work about, and the recent work I've been doing is looking at this idea of the submerged history and the echo of history, and working underwater and working with gold pigments and things that are floating out of that water, dropping through the surface, breaking the surface, and looking through. These are all objects from my father's house in Alexandria in Egypt, and there are all these objects that were disappearing when he had to leave, and what's happening now, it sort of starts to echo these ideas of loss of memory, loss of culture, and the evisceration of various cultures that are happening through the region. And that'll do. Thank you very much.